Imagine being a parent. Your 6-year-old daughter is tucked safely in bed, her nightlight glowing softly in the corner. You kiss her goodnight, close the door, and drift off to sleep yourself. But outside, in the darkness, someone is watching. Someone who has been walking through your neighborhood, peering into windows, searching. And tonight, he finds what he's been looking for. Your daughter's room. That soft glow from her nightlight. And in the morning, she's gone. Vanished from her own bed. This isn't a nightmare you wake up from. This is what happened to the Kunash family on May 10, 1979, in Merritt Island, Florida. And what followed was nearly half a century of legal battles, appeals, and a family's desperate wait for justice. This is the story of Rebecca Kunash. Before we dive deep into one of Florida's most heartbreaking and legally complex cases, I need 3 things from you. First, hit that subscribe button right now for Coldcase Crimelab. We bring you the cases that deserve to be remembered, the victims whose stories must be told. Second, smash that like button. It tells the algorithm that cases like Rebecca's matter, that true crime isn't just entertainment, it's about justice and awareness. And third, drop a comment below telling me what cold case you want us to investigate next. Your engagement literally brings these forgotten stories back into the light where they belong. Now, let's get into what happened on that terrible night in May of 1979. Merritt Island, Florida. If you've never been there, picture a place where the Atlantic Ocean meets family neighborhoods, where NASA's Kennedy Space Center dominates the landscape, where the smell of salt water mixes with freshly cut grass, where people know their neighbors and kids ride bikes until the streetlights come on. It's the kind of place where families moved in the late 1970s because it felt safe. Because you could leave your windows open on warm spring nights. Because your kids could play in the front yard without constant supervision. It was the American dream wrapped up in a coastal Florida package. Palm trees swaying. Boats in driveways. Barbecues on weekends. The kind of place where nothing truly terrible was supposed to happen. May 10, 1979. A Thursday. The kind of day that blends into all the others. The kind of day that most people forget by the weekend. But for the Kunash family, this Thursday would become seared into their memories forever. This was the last normal day they would ever have. The last day their daughter would be alive. The last day before their entire world collapsed. Rebecca Kunash. Everyone called her Becky. She was 6 years old. First grade. Tiny for her age, with that kind of bright energy that 6-year-olds have, that unfiltered joy and excitement about everything. The kind of kid who still believed in magic, who got excited about school plays and picking out special outfits, who hugged with her whole body and laughed without holding back. She had something to look forward to that week. Something she'd been practicing for. Something that made her bounce around the house with anticipation. Her school was putting on a play, and Becky had been chosen for a special role. She was going to be the narrator. For a first grader, this was huge. This meant learning lines, speaking in front of everyone, being responsible for keeping the story moving. She'd been practicing those lines for weeks. Over and over. At the dinner table. In the car. Before bed. Her parents had listened to her recite them so many times they probably had them memorized themselves. The outfit was already picked out. Becky had chosen it with her mother, probably standing in front of her closet debating between options, trying things on, wanting everything to be perfect. Kids take these things seriously. It wasn't just a school play. It was her moment to shine. The outfit was laid out in her room, ready for the next day. The lines were reviewed one last time. Everything was prepared. Everything was perfect. Tomorrow was going to be a big day. That Thursday evening proceeded like countless other Thursday evenings in countless other American homes. Dinner was eaten. Homework was finished. Television flickered in the living room. The sun set over the Florida coast, painting the sky in oranges and pinks before fading to deep blue and finally black. The temperature dropped slightly, bringing that pleasant evening coolness that makes Florida springs so comfortable. Windows were open to let in the breeze. Screens kept the bugs out. The neighborhood settled into its nightly rhythm. Lights clicked off one by one as families headed to bed. At 8 o'clock in the evening, Becky's father went through the bedtime routine. The same routine they'd done hundreds of times before. Teeth brushed. Pajamas on. Covers pulled back. Becky climbed into bed. Her father tucked the blankets around her, pulling them up under her chin the way she liked. He kissed her forehead. Said goodnight. Sweet dreams. See you in the morning. Ready for your big day tomorrow. All those little phrases parents say without thinking, never imagining it might be the last time. The night light was already on, casting its soft glow across the room, creating familiar shadows on the walls. The kind of nightlight that makes kids feel safe in the dark. The kind that lets parents peek in and check on sleeping children without turning on harsh overhead lights. The kind that, on this particular night, would serve as a beacon for someone who had no business being anywhere near that house. Rebecca's father closed her bedroom door. The house grew quiet. Parents settled into their own routines. Maybe reading. Maybe watching late-night television. Maybe just talking about the day, making plans for tomorrow, discussing ordinary things that ordinary families discuss. Outside, the neighborhood was dark and still. Most people were already asleep. A few porch lights remained on. Streetlights created pools of illumination along the roads. Crickets chirped. Palm fronds rustled in the breeze. It was peaceful. Normal. Safe. But someone was out there in that darkness. Someone who didn't belong. Someone who had been drinking at local bars that evening. Someone who had developed a habit, a compulsion, something dark that he later admitted to investigators. He walked through neighborhoods at night. And he looked into windows. He searched for opportunities. He searched for victims. And that night, the glow from Rebecca Kunash's nightlight drew him like a moth to a flame. Brian Frederick Jennings. 20 years old. A United States Marine stationed in Okinawa, Japan, currently on leave and visiting Florida. Young. Strong. Trained in combat and survival. Someone who should have been representing the best of American military service. Someone who instead was about to commit an act so horrific, so evil, so completely devoid of humanity that it would shock even hardened law enforcement officials who thought they'd seen everything. Jennings had been walking through the neighborhood. Looking. Watching. And then he saw it. That soft glow coming from a ground floor window. He approached. Moved closer. Looked inside. And there she was. A 6-year-old child, sleeping peacefully in her bed. Vulnerable. Alone. Trusting that the walls of her home would keep her safe. Trusting that the adults in her life had created a secure world for her. That trust was about to be shattered in the worst possible way. What Jennings did next requires a level of premeditation that makes it even more chilling. He didn't act on impulse. He didn't panic or make rash decisions. He carefully removed the window screen. Quietly. Methodically. Taking his time to avoid making noise that might wake the household. He pulled the screen away from the window frame and set it aside. Then he opened the window further. And he climbed inside. Into a little girl's bedroom. Into a home where he had absolutely no right to be. Into a space that should have been the safest place in the world for a sleeping child. Imagine being Rebecca in that moment. Imagine drifting in sleep, maybe dreaming about tomorrow's play, maybe seeing yourself on that stage delivering your lines perfectly. And then suddenly there's a hand over your mouth. A stranger's hand. Rough. Strong. Silencing your scream before you can even fully wake up. The terror must have been absolute. The confusion. The inability to understand what was happening or why. 6 years old. Being pulled from your bed by a stranger in the middle of the night. Feeling yourself being carried toward the window. Feeling the night air hit your skin. Being taken from your home. From your parents who are sleeping just rooms away, completely unaware. From your safe little world. Into darkness. Into a nightmare. Jennings carried Rebecca to his car. A child. A first grader. Small enough to be carried. Too terrified or too controlled to fight back or scream loud enough to wake anyone. He put her in his vehicle. He drove away from that neighborhood. Away from her home. Away from any possibility of rescue. He drove to a remote area. Somewhere he'd probably scouted beforehand. Somewhere he knew he wouldn't be interrupted. Near the Girard Street Canal. A dark, isolated spot where nobody would see what he was about to do. Where nobody would hear. Where a little girl's cries for help would disappear into the night. What happened next is detailed in court documents. In autopsy reports. In testimony from medical examiners. In evidence that was presented at trial after trial after trial. It's documented in official records because it had to be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Because the justice system requires evidence. Because even monsters get due process. But knowing that these facts are officially recorded, clinically described in legal language, doesn't make them any less horrifying. The medical examiner's autopsy revealed the full scope of what Brian Jennings did to Rebecca Kunash. She was sexually assaulted. A 6-year-old child. A first grader who should have been home in bed, safe and warm, dreaming about her school play. Instead, she was being violated by a 20-year-old Marine in a remote area near a canal. The physical evidence was there. The injuries were documented. This wasn't speculation or assumption. This was proven fact, entered into evidence, confirmed by medical professionals. But Jennings didn't stop there. After sexually assaulting this child, after already committing an act that would warrant the harshest punishment, he did something that proves just how depraved, how utterly lacking in humanity he truly was. According to the court documents from Circuit Judge Charles Harris's 1986 sentencing order, Jennings lifted Rebecca's small body. And he slammed her head into the ground. With force. With violence. With enough impact to fracture her skull. A 6-year-old child. 60 pounds maybe. 48 inches tall. He lifted her up and smashed her head into the earth. And she survived it. Think about that for a moment. This tiny child, after being kidnapped from her bed, after being sexually assaulted, after having her skull fractured, was still alive. Still breathing. Still clinging to life with everything a 6-year-old body could muster. Maybe she was unconscious. Maybe she was aware but unable to move or speak. Maybe she was crying. Maybe she was calling for her mommy and daddy. We'll never know what those final moments were like for her. We'll never know what went through her mind. We only know what Jennings did next. He took her into the canal. The Girard Street Canal. And he held her head underwater. A child with a fractured skull. A child who had already endured more horror than most people experience in a lifetime. A child who probably couldn't have fought back even if she'd had the strength. He held her head under the water. And he waited. The medical examiner later testified that she was held underwater for approximately 10 minutes. 10 minutes. 600 seconds. Think about how long 10 minutes actually is. Think about holding your breath for even 1 minute. Think about the panic that sets in. The desperate need for air. The instinct to fight, to surface, to breathe. Now imagine being a 6-year-old child. Injured. Terrified. Helpless. And someone is holding you underwater. For 10 minutes. Rebecca Kunash drowned in that canal. She died alone, in the dark, in pain and terror, at the hands of a stranger who had stolen her from her bed. Her last thoughts were probably of her parents. Of home. Of wanting her mommy and daddy to save her. But they couldn't. They didn't even know she was gone yet. They were home, sleeping, believing their daughter was safe in her bed, believing tomorrow she would perform in her school play, believing they lived in a world where children could sleep safely in their own rooms. After Rebecca was dead, Jennings left her body in the canal. Nude. Floating in the water. Discarded like trash. Like she was nothing. Like she hadn't been a real person with hopes and dreams and people who loved her. Like she hadn't been practicing her lines for the school play. Like she hadn't picked out a special outfit with her mother. Like she hadn't been somebody's entire world. The next morning, May 11, 1979, Rebecca's body was discovered floating in the Girard Street Canal. Someone saw her. Someone called the police. And suddenly, a routine Friday morning in Merritt Island, Florida, became something else entirely. Crime scene tape. Police vehicles. Detectives. Medical examiners. Photographers documenting evidence. All descending on this quiet area near the canal. All because a Marine on leave had decided to act on his darkest impulses. The Kunash family's Friday morning was different too. They woke up to find Rebecca's bed empty. The window open. The screen removed. Their daughter gone. Can you imagine that moment? Going to wake your child for school and finding an empty bed? Seeing the open window and knowing, just knowing, that something terrible has happened? The panic. The horror. The desperate hope that maybe she just wandered outside, maybe she's playing somewhere, maybe there's an innocent explanation. But deep down, knowing. Knowing that opened window means something bad. Something really, really bad. And then the police arrive. And they tell you that a body has been found. A child's body. In a canal. And you have to identify whether it's your daughter. Whether the little girl you tucked into bed last night, the little girl who was supposed to perform in her school play today, the little girl who had her whole life ahead of her, is now a body in a canal. Rebecca's parents had to face that. Had to identify their daughter's remains. Had to see what had been done to her. Had to begin processing a loss so profound, so violent, so preventable, that it would define the rest of their lives. But even as the Kunash family was learning their daughter was dead, law enforcement was already working the case. And they were about to get a break that would lead them to Brian Jennings faster than anyone could have anticipated. Hours after Rebecca's body was discovered, Jennings was arrested. But not for her murder. Not yet. He was picked up on an unrelated traffic warrant in Orange County. Just a routine arrest for a minor violation. The kind of thing that happens dozens of times every day across Florida. Someone has an outstanding warrant. They get pulled over or stopped for something else. The warrant pops up. They get arrested. Usually, they bond out within hours or days. Usually, it's no big deal. Usually, it doesn't lead to anything significant. But investigators from the Brevard County Sheriff's Department were already working Rebecca's case. And they were doing what good investigators do. They were looking at evidence. They were processing the crime scene. They were following leads. And they found something. Fingerprints. On Rebecca's bedroom window. Clear, identifiable fingerprints left behind when someone removed that screen and opened that window. And there was more. A shoe print. Outside that same window. In the soft dirt beneath Rebecca's window, someone had left a footprint. Clear enough to make an impression. Clear enough to potentially match to a specific shoe. Clear enough to be evidence. They started running those prints through databases. They started looking for matches. And they found one. Brian Frederick Jennings. 20 years old. United States Marine. Currently on leave. And currently sitting in an Orange County jail on that traffic warrant. Suddenly, a routine arrest became very interesting to Brevard County investigators. They contacted Orange County. They requested Jennings be held. They headed to the jail to have a conversation. At 1:08 in the morning on May 12, 1979, Detective Hugh Pohl and Agent Porter sat down with Brian Frederick Jennings in an interrogation room. Less than 24 hours after Rebecca's body had been discovered. Less than 36 hours after she'd been taken from her bed. The case was moving fast. The evidence was fresh. And the investigators were about to get a confession that would seal Jennings's fate. They read him his Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights? Jennings said he did. He agreed to talk. He waived his right to remain silent. And he started admitting things. He told them about his habit. About walking through neighborhoods at night. About looking into windows. About being a voyeur, a peeping Tom, someone who got his kicks from watching people in their homes without their knowledge. He admitted to being near the Kunash residence. He admitted to being in that neighborhood. He placed himself at the scene. And with his fingerprints on the window and his shoe print in the dirt, the evidence was overwhelming. He was there. He'd been in Rebecca's room. He'd taken her. And after hours of interrogation, after investigators laid out the evidence they had, after making it clear that they knew he'd done this, Jennings confessed to all of it. The kidnapping. The sexual assault. The murder. Everything. Cases don't always come together this quickly. Sometimes investigations drag on for months or years. Sometimes cases go cold. Sometimes killers are never caught. But in Rebecca Kunash's case, within 48 hours of her body being discovered, her killer was in custody and had confessed. Her parents knew who had taken their daughter. They knew what had happened to her. They knew the monster responsible had been caught. And they believed, like most people would believe, that justice would be swift. That the man who confessed to kidnapping, sexually assaulting, and murdering their 6-year-old daughter would face the consequences quickly. That the legal system would work the way it's supposed to work. That their daughter's killer would be punished. They had no idea it would take 46 years. Brian Frederick Jennings was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual battery, and burglary. 4 serious charges. Any one of them could result in significant prison time. All of them together, especially with the age of the victim, especially with the brutality of the crimes, especially with the confession, meant Jennings was facing the death penalty. In 1979, Florida had an active death penalty. The electric chair, known as Old Sparky, was the method of execution. And prosecutors were absolutely seeking death for Brian Jennings. The first trial took place in 1980. 1 year after Rebecca's murder. The evidence was presented. The confession was entered. The forensic evidence, the fingerprints, the shoe print, the autopsy results, all of it was shown to the jury. The defense tried to argue what they could, but there wasn't much to work with. Their client had confessed. The physical evidence was overwhelming. There was no question about whether Jennings had killed Rebecca Kunash. The only question was what punishment he would receive. The jury found him guilty on all counts. First-degree murder. Kidnapping. Sexual battery. Burglary. Guilty, 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 guilty. And then came the penalty phase. In capital cases, there are 2 parts. First, the guilt phase, where the jury decides if the defendant committed the crimes. Second, the penalty phase, where the jury recommends either life in prison or death. The same jury that convicted Jennings had to decide whether he should live or die. They recommended death. On May 7, 1980, Brian Frederick Jennings was sentenced to death for the murder of Rebecca Kunash. Exactly 1 year and 3 days after he'd taken her from her bed. The Kunash family breathed a sigh of relief. Justice had been served. Their daughter's killer would face the ultimate punishment. The case was closed. Or so they thought. But this is where the story takes a turn that I think a lot of people don't understand about the American justice system. Getting a death sentence is one thing. Actually being executed is something else entirely. The appeals process in capital cases is lengthy, complex, and designed to ensure that innocent people aren't executed. Which is good. Which is necessary. Which is how it should be. But it also means that even in cases where guilt is absolutely certain, where the evidence is overwhelming, where the defendant confessed, the process can take decades. Literal decades. And for the families of victims, that means decades of reliving the worst day of their lives over and over again. Decades of court hearings. Decades of appeals. Decades of waiting for the justice they thought they'd already received. On April 8, 1982, the Florida Supreme Court overturned Brian Jennings's conviction and death sentence. 2 years after he'd been sentenced to death, the state's highest court said there had been procedural errors in his trial. Errors significant enough to warrant a new trial. They didn't say he was innocent. They didn't say the evidence was flawed. They didn't say the confession was invalid. They said the trial had procedural problems. And because of those problems, Jennings got a do-over. A second trial. Another chance. Imagine being Rebecca's parents. Imagine thinking the case was over. Thinking your daughter's killer was going to face justice. Beginning to process your grief, beginning to try to move forward with your life, beginning to find some semblance of peace. And then being told that actually, there's going to be another trial. Actually, you're going to have to go through all of this again. Actually, you're going to have to sit in a courtroom again and listen to the details of what was done to your daughter. Actually, justice is going to be delayed because of procedural technicalities. The second trial took place in July of 1982. Once again, the evidence was presented. Once again, the confession was entered. Once again, the jury heard about what Brian Jennings did to 6-year-old Rebecca Kunash. And once again, they found him guilty on all counts. First-degree murder. Kidnapping. Sexual battery. Burglary. Guilty across the board. No question. No doubt. And once again, the jury had to decide on a penalty. Once again, they deliberated on whether this man should live or die for what he'd done to a first grader. And once again, they recommended death. This time by a vote of 9-3. 9 jurors believed death was the appropriate punishment. 3 believed life in prison was sufficient. But the majority ruled. 9-3 in favor of death. Brian Jennings was, for the second time, sentenced to death for murdering Rebecca Kunash. The Kunash family went through the entire process again. Sat through the trial again. Heard the evidence again. Relived their daughter's death again. And received the same outcome. Death. Justice. Closure. Again. For the second time, they thought it was over. For the second time, they believed their daughter's killer would face the ultimate punishment. For the second time, they were wrong. In May of 1985, the Florida Supreme Court once again overturned the conviction and death sentence. Once again, they cited legal errors. Once again, they ordered a new trial. Once again, the Kunash family was told that justice would have to wait. That they would have to endure another trial. That their daughter's killer would get yet another chance to avoid the death penalty. 3 years after the second conviction. 5 years after the first conviction. 6 years after Rebecca's murder. And they were back to square one. Again. The third trial was scheduled for March of 1986. But this time, there was a change. The venue was moved. Instead of holding the trial in Brevard County, where Rebecca had lived and died, where the crime had occurred, where the community knew the case intimately, the trial was moved to Bay County. The reasoning was to ensure impartiality. To find jurors who hadn't been saturated with media coverage of the case. To give Jennings the fairest trial possible. Which again, is how the system is supposed to work. But for the Kunash family, it meant traveling to a different part of the state. It meant being surrounded by people who didn't know their daughter. It meant feeling even more disconnected from a process that was supposed to be about justice for Rebecca. For the third time, a jury heard the evidence against Brian Frederick Jennings. For the third time, they heard about the fingerprints on the window. The shoe print in the dirt. The confession. The autopsy results. The sexual assault. The fractured skull. The drowning. Everything. And for the third time, they found him guilty. First-degree murder. Kidnapping. Sexual battery. Burglary. 3 separate juries. 3 separate trials. 3 separate guilty verdicts. No jury that heard the evidence thought Brian Jennings was innocent. No jury that learned what he did to Rebecca Kunash thought he didn't deserve to be punished. And for the third time, he was sentenced to death. March of 1986. 7 years after Rebecca's murder. 3 trials. 3 death sentences. Surely, the Kunash family thought, this has to be it. Surely, after 3 separate juries all reached the same conclusion, after 3 separate death sentences, after 7 years of legal proceedings, surely now justice will be served. Surely now their daughter's killer will finally face the consequences of his actions. Surely now they can begin to find some peace. But the appeals continued. And continued. And continued. 4 decades. 1987. Jennings filed his 4th appeal. Denied. 1991. His 5th appeal. Denied. 1998. A motion for retrial. Denied. 2001. 6th appeal. Denied. 2005. Federal appeal. Denied. 2007. 11th Circuit Court appeal. Denied. 2008. United States Supreme Court dismissed his final appeal. Dismissed. Not even considered worthy of full review. Dismissed. By this point, almost 30 years had passed since Rebecca's murder. 30 years of appeals. 30 years of the Kunash family waiting. Hoping. Praying that each denial would be the last one. That eventually, the death sentence would actually be carried out. That their daughter's killer would finally face justice. But even after the Supreme Court dismissed his appeal in 2008, Brian Jennings remained on death row. Alive. Being fed. Being housed. Being given medical care. While Rebecca Kunash was in a grave. While her parents grew older, their grief never fading, their frustration mounting with each passing year. 2018. Another appeal to the Florida Supreme Court. 10 years after the U.S. Supreme Court had dismissed his previous appeal. 10 years of silence, and then suddenly, another legal filing. Another attempt to avoid execution. Another delay. Another moment of hope for the Kunash family, thinking maybe this time the appeal would be denied and an execution date would finally be set. And it was denied. The Florida Supreme Court rejected his appeal. But still, no execution date. Throughout all of this, Rebecca's father made his intentions clear. He publicly stated that he intended to witness the execution of his daughter's killer. He wanted to be there. He wanted to look Brian Jennings in the eye as the state of Florida carried out the sentence that had been handed down 3 separate times by 3 separate juries. He wanted closure. He wanted to see justice done. And he was willing to wait as long as it took. The years turned into decades. The 1980s became the 90s. The 90s became the 2000s. The 2000s became the 2010s. And still, Brian Jennings sat on death row. Still alive. Still appealing. Still avoiding the punishment he'd received 4 decades earlier. And then, in October of 2025, something changed. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed a death warrant for Brian Frederick Jennings. After 46 years. After countless appeals. After decades of delays. The governor put his signature on a document that set an execution date. And he made a statement. A simple, straightforward statement that captured the frustration of everyone who had followed this case. He said, "Justice delayed is justice denied. Justice delayed is justice denied." Think about that phrase. Think about what it means. Justice delayed is justice denied. When someone is convicted of a crime and sentenced to a punishment, but that punishment is delayed for years or decades, is it really justice? When a family is told their loved one's killer will face the death penalty, but then they have to wait almost half a century for that sentence to be carried out, have they really received justice? When appeals stretch on for longer than the victim's entire life, when the legal process takes so long that parents grow old and die before seeing their child's killer executed, is that justice? For the Kunash family, Governor DeSantis's decision to sign that death warrant was vindication. It was acknowledgement that yes, the delays had been excessive. Yes, the process had taken too long. Yes, it was time for the sentence to finally be carried out. After 46 years. After a lifetime of waiting. Justice was finally going to be served. But even with a death warrant signed, even with an execution date set, Jennings's attorneys weren't done. They filed last-minute appeals. Because that's what defense attorneys do. That's their job. To advocate for their client. To explore every possible legal avenue. To delay the inevitable for as long as possible. And in this case, they had an argument. They claimed that Jennings's due process rights had been violated. They pointed out that his previous attorney had died in 2022. That Jennings had been without legal representation for 3 years. From 2022 to 2025, he'd had no attorney. And they argued that this violated his constitutional right to counsel. That he couldn't properly appeal his case without a lawyer. That the execution should be delayed until these issues were resolved. The appeals went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The highest court in the land. The final stop for any legal challenge. And on November 13, 2025, the Supreme Court issued its decision. They rejected the appeals. They ruled that the execution could proceed. That after 46 years, after 3 trials, after dozens of appeals, after every possible legal challenge had been exhausted, it was time. Justice would finally be served. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. I want to know that you're engaged with Rebecca's case, that you understand the importance of remembering victims like her. And while you're down there in the comments, tell me what you think about the 46-year delay. Was it necessary to ensure Jennings got a fair trial? Or was it an abuse of the appeals process that denied the Kunash family the justice they deserved? I want to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button for Coldcase Crimelab. We're not stopping. We're going to keep bringing you these stories. Keep demanding accountability. Keep honoring the victims. November 13, 2025. That evening. Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida. This is where Florida's death row is located. This is where executions are carried out. This is where Brian Frederick Jennings, now 66 years old, had spent decades. Waiting. Appealing. Knowing that eventually, this day might come. And now it had. The execution protocol in Florida is specific and detailed. There are procedures. Steps that must be followed. The condemned is given a last meal. Jennings's meal choices aren't public record, but he was allowed to request food within certain parameters. He was allowed visits from family or spiritual advisors if he wanted them. He was allowed to make final statements. Everything is documented. Everything is witnessed. Everything is done according to law. Witnesses are required at executions. There are official witnesses. Members of the media. Family members of the victim if they choose to attend. And we know that Rebecca's father had stated his intention to be there. To witness this moment. To see the man who killed his daughter finally face the ultimate punishment. After 46 years. After a lifetime of waiting. He was going to be there. The execution chamber at Florida State Prison is a small room. Clinical. Sterile. There's a gurney where the condemned is strapped down. There are windows where witnesses can observe. There's medical equipment for the lethal injection. It's not dramatic. It's not theatrical. It's just a room where the state carries out the sentence that was imposed by the courts. Brian Frederick Jennings was brought into that room. At 66 years old, he'd spent more of his life on death row than he'd spent as a free man. He'd been 20 when he killed Rebecca. He was 66 when the state of Florida was about to end his life. 46 years in between. 46 years of appeals and delays and legal maneuvering. 46 years that Rebecca Kunash never got to have. She died at 6. She never turned 7. Never became a teenager. Never graduated high school. Never went to college. Never fell in love. Never got married. Never had children. Never had a career. Never traveled. Never experienced any of the things that make up a human life. Brian Jennings got 46 extra years. 46 years he didn't deserve. 46 years that should have been Rebecca's. He was strapped to the gurney. Arms extended. 4 lines inserted. This is how lethal injection works. A series of drugs are administered through those 4 lines. The first drug is a sedative, meant to render the condemned unconscious. The second stops the breathing. The third stops the heart. It's designed to be humane. To be painless. To be as close to a peaceful death as possible. Which is more than Rebecca got. She drowned in a canal. Conscious. Terrified. In pain from her fractured skull. Held underwater for 10 minutes by a man twice her size. There was nothing humane about her death. Nothing peaceful. Nothing painless. Before the execution began, Jennings was asked if he had any final words. This is standard procedure. The condemned is given one last opportunity to speak. To apologize. To explain. To express remorse. To say goodbye. To say anything. Some people use this moment to apologize to their victims' families. Some maintain their innocence to the very end. Some quote scripture or poetry. Some remain silent. Brian Jennings was asked if he had any final words. He replied, "No. No. That's it. One word. No final statement. No apology to the Kunash family. No expression of remorse for what he did to their daughter. No acknowledgement of the pain he caused. No explanation for his actions. No nothing. Just no." After 46 years, after taking a 6-year-old child from her bed and sexually assaulting her and fracturing her skull and drowning her in a canal, after putting her family through decades of legal battles and appeals, after forcing them to relive their daughter's murder over and over again in courtroom after courtroom, Brian Jennings had nothing to say. No. At 6:04 in the evening on November 13, 2025, the lethal injection began. The drugs flowed through the 4 lines into Jennings's bloodstream. Witnesses later reported what happened next. Jennings jerked once. A physical reaction to the drugs entering his system. Then he twitched several times. Small movements. Involuntary. And then he became still. Around 6:06 in the evening, just 2 minutes after the injection began, Brian Jennings appeared to lose consciousness. His breathing slowed. Then stopped. His heart continued for a few moments longer, but eventually, it too stopped. At 6:20 in the evening, 16 minutes after the injection began, Brian Frederick Jennings was pronounced dead. The execution was complete. The sentence had been carried out. After 46 years. After 3 trials. After dozens of appeals. After a lifetime of waiting for the Kunash family. It was done. November 13, 2025, marked the 16th execution in Florida that year. 2025 was a year of significant death penalty activity in Florida. 16 executions. 16 death row inmates whose appeals had run out. 16 sentences finally carried out. And Brian Jennings was one of them. 18th Judicial Circuit State Attorney Will Shiner released a statement following the execution. He said, "The family deserves this finality. The family deserves this finality. After 46 years. After enduring 3 trials. After sitting through countless appeals hearings. After growing old while waiting for justice. After watching their daughter's killer live on for decades while Rebecca remained 6 years old forever in their memories. The family deserves this finality. But did they get it? After 46 years, can there really be closure? Can there really be finality? Or is the wound too old, too deep, the scar tissue too thick?" Rebecca's father, who publicly stated he intended to witness the execution, finally got what he'd waited nearly half a century for. He saw his daughter's killer die. But did it bring him peace? Did it ease his pain? Did it make up for 46 years of waiting? Did it bring Rebecca back? Of course not. Nothing brings her back. No execution. No sentence. No amount of justice can undo what was done. Rebecca Kunash is still gone. She's still been dead for 46 years. She still never got to perform in that first-grade play. She still never got to wear that outfit she picked out with her mother. She still never got to grow up and experience life. And no execution changes that. Justice isn't about bringing victims back. It's about holding perpetrators accountable. It's about consequences for actions. It's about society saying that certain behaviors are so beyond the pale, so horrific, so evil, that the perpetrator forfeits their right to live. And by that measure, justice was finally served on November 13, 2025, when Brian Jennings died on a gurney in Florida State Prison. But the question remains. Why did it take 46 years? Why did a man who was caught within hours of his crime, who confessed, who was convicted 3 separate times by 3 separate juries, who had overwhelming physical evidence against him, why did that man get to live for 46 more years after murdering a 6-year-old child? The answer is complicated. It involves constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. It involves the right to due process. It involves appellate procedures designed to catch errors and prevent innocent people from being executed. It involves a legal system that moves slowly and deliberately, especially in capital cases. And all of that is important. All of that is necessary. We don't want innocent people executed. We don't want convictions based on faulty evidence or coerced confessions or incompetent defense attorneys. We want the system to work correctly. We want checks and balances. We want multiple levels of review. We want to be absolutely certain before the state takes someone's life. All of that makes sense in theory. But in practice, it means that families like the Kunashes wait. And wait. And wait. It means that people who are unquestionably guilty, people who confessed, people who were caught red-handed, people who no reasonable person believes are innocent, those people get to file appeal after appeal after appeal. They get to exploit every technicality. They get to drag the process out for decades. And the victims' families have to endure it. Have to relive the worst moments of their lives over and over again with each new hearing, each new trial, each new appeal. Is there a better way? Should there be a limit on appeals in cases where guilt is absolutely certain? Should there be a faster track for cases with confessions and overwhelming physical evidence? Should families have to wait 46 years for justice? These are questions that society continues to wrestle with. Questions without easy answers. Questions that pit important constitutional rights against the equally important right of victims' families to see justice served in a reasonable timeframe. What we know for certain is that Rebecca Kunash never got justice in life. She never got to grow up. She never got to experience the things that make life worth living. She got 6 years. 6 years of life before a 20-year-old Marine decided to look in her window, climb into her room, and destroy everything. And even in death, she had to wait 46 years for her killer to face the consequences of his actions. 46 years during which he got to wake up every morning. Got to eat meals. Got to read books. Got to watch television. Got to breathe. Got to exist. While Rebecca Kunash remained 6 years old in a grave. Brian Jennings got 46 years that he didn't deserve. 46 years that should have been Rebecca's. 46 years during which he should have been dead but wasn't, thanks to an appeals process that values the rights of the accused over the rights of victims. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe it's better to err on the side of protecting the accused, even when it means guilty people live longer than they should. Maybe that's the price we pay for a justice system that tries to get it right. But it doesn't make it any easier for the families who have to wait. Who have to endure. Who have to watch their loved one's killer grow old while their loved one remains forever young in memory. Rebecca, Becky Kunash. 6 years old. First grade. Narrator in the school play. A girl who picked out a special outfit with her mother. A girl who practiced her lines until she had them memorized. A girl who had a nightlight in her room that was supposed to keep her safe. A girl who trusted that the adults in her life would protect her. A girl who should have woken up on May 11, 1979, and performed in that play. A girl who should have grown up and graduated and gone to college and had a career and fallen in love and gotten married and had children and grandchildren and lived a full, rich, beautiful life. Instead, she got 6 years. And a death so brutal that even hardened investigators were shaken by it. And a 46-year wait for justice. Not justice for her because she's gone. But justice for her family. Justice for her community. Justice for everyone who believes that people who do monstrous things should face monstrous consequences. On November 13, 2025, at 6:20 in the evening, Brian Frederick Jennings was pronounced dead. The sentence that was first handed down on May 7, 1980, was finally carried out 45 years, 6 months, and 6 days later. 16,664 days. 399,936 hours. Almost half a century. Long enough for a child to grow into middle age. Long enough for parents to grow old. Long enough for the world to change completely. Long enough for technology to advance from cassette tapes to streaming services, from rotary phones to smartphones, from 3 television channels to infinite internet content. Long enough for everything to be different except one thing. Rebecca Kunash was still dead. And Brian Jennings was, until November 13, still alive. But not anymore. Finally, after 46 years, the sentence was carried out. Finally, the Kunash family got the finality that State Attorney Shiner said they deserved. Finally, Rebecca's killer was gone. Finally. This is the story we need to remember. Not just because it's horrific. Not just because it's tragic. Not just because it involves a child victim and a brutal murder. We need to remember it because it illustrates everything that's broken about the death penalty system in America. We need to remember it because it shows how justice delayed really is justice denied. We need to remember it because families like the Kunashes shouldn't have to wait half a century to see sentences carried out. We need to remember it because Rebecca Kunash deserves to be remembered as more than just a victim. She deserves to be remembered as a 6-year-old girl who loved school plays and picking out outfits with her mother and sleeping with a nightlight. She deserves to be remembered as a real person whose life mattered and whose death should never have happened. And we need to remember Brian Frederick Jennings too. Not with sympathy. Not with understanding. Not with any attempt to humanize or explain away what he did. But as a reminder that evil exists. That some people make choices so depraved, so cruel, so utterly devoid of humanity that they forfeit their right to live among civilized society. That a 20-year-old Marine who should have been representing the best of American values instead became a monster who preyed on a sleeping child. That someone looked into a window, saw a nightlight glowing in a little girl's room, and decided to climb through that window and destroy an entire family. Merritt Island, Florida, is still a quiet neighborhood. Families still live there. Kids still ride bikes. Palm trees still sway in the breeze. The Girard Street Canal still flows. Life goes on. But somewhere in that community, there are people who remember May of 1979. Who remember when Rebecca Kunash was taken. Who remember when her body was found. Who remember when the neighborhood stopped feeling quite so safe. Who remember locking windows that used to stay open. Who remember checking on their children a little more often. Who remember that terrible things can happen anywhere, even in neighborhoods that look like they were handpicked for postcards. And somewhere, Rebecca Kunash is buried. A grave that's been there for 46 years. A headstone that marks a life that lasted only 6 years. A place where her parents could visit and leave flowers and talk to their daughter and wonder what she would have been like if she'd lived. Would she have become a doctor? A teacher? An artist? A mother herself? What would her voice have sounded like as an adult? What would she have looked like at 16, at 25, at 40, at 52, which is how old she would be today if she'd been allowed to live? We'll never know. Because Brian Jennings decided that his desires mattered more than her life. This is Coldcase Crimelab. This is what we do. We tell these stories. We honor these victims. We demand accountability. We refuse to forget. Because if we don't remember Rebecca Kunash, who will? If we don't tell her story, who will? If we don't say her name and talk about what happened to her and insist that it mattered, then she becomes just another statistic. Just another child victim in a true crime database. Just another cold case file. And she deserves better than that. Every victim deserves better than that. So remember Rebecca, Becky Kunash. 6 years old. First grade. Narrator in a school play she never got to perform in. A little girl with a nightlight who should have been safe in her own bed. A child whose life was stolen by a monster. A daughter whose parents had to wait 46 years to see justice served. A victim who deserves to be remembered as more than the terrible thing that happened to her. A real person who lived and laughed and loved and mattered. And remember that justice delayed is justice denied. Remember that the Kunash family waited almost half a century. Remember that Rebecca never got to grow up. Remember that evil exists and sometimes it looks like a 20-year-old Marine walking through neighborhoods at night. Remember that windows can be locked but monsters can still find a way in. Remember that our justice system is imperfect and sometimes the process matters more than the outcome and families pay the price. But most of all, remember that Rebecca Kunash was here. She existed. She was loved. She mattered. And she deserved so much better than what she got. She deserved to grow up. She deserved to live. She deserved justice that didn't take 46 years. She deserved everything. And all she got was 6 years and a nightmare. Rest in peace, Rebecca. Your story has been told. Your name has been spoken. Your life has been honored. And your killer has finally faced justice. 46 years too late. But finally. Before you go, I need one more thing from you. If this case moved you, if Rebecca's story matters to you, if you believe that victims deserve to be remembered and justice deserves to be served, then I need you to do something. First, leave a comment. Tell me what you think about this case. Tell me how you feel about the 46-year delay. Tell me if you think the death penalty is justice or if there's a better way. Tell me what other cases you want Coldcase Crimelab to investigate. Your comments matter. They tell me what content you want. They help this channel grow. They keep these stories alive. Second, hit that like button. I know I've asked before, but this is important. The algorithm shows these videos to more people when they get likes. That means more people learn about Rebecca. More people understand what happened to her. More people remember her name. Every like helps bring attention to victims who deserve to be remembered. It's a small action, but it has a big impact. And third, subscribe to Coldcase Crimelab. We're not stopping. We're going to keep bringing you cases like this. Cases that matter. Cases where victims deserve justice. Cases where families deserve answers. Cases that the rest of the world might have forgotten but that we refuse to let go. When you subscribe, you're joining a community that cares about these stories. That believes victims matter. That demands accountability. That refuses to let time erase the memory of people like Becky Kunash. This is Coldcase Crimelab, where we don't just tell true crime stories. We honor victims. We seek truth. We demand justice. And we never, ever forget. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for remembering Rebecca. And I'll see you in the next case.